Opening the English, white immediately claims central influence and prepares queenside expansion, creating interesting positional imbalances from the outset. Establishing central presence and preparing piece development, this move mirrors white's ambition for board control. Developing a knight here establishes central influence and prepares for further queenside expansion, aiming for quick piece activity. Developing the knight towards the center immediately contests white's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling. Developing the knight to f3 prepares to castle and contests the e5 pawn, setting up a principled English opening. Developing this knight neatly supports the central pawns and prepares for further action. Preparing to fianchetto, white aims to control the long diagonal and foster a harmonious pawn structure, potentially leading to a kingside attack later. Opening the center immediately creates dynamic imbalances, forcing white to confront sharp central play or cede initiative. Opening the center swiftly often forces tactical calculations and can lead to dynamic play. Instantly recapturing the pawn resolves pawn structure issues and opens the knight for development, creating dynamic central play. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal directly challenges black's central pawn structure and prepares for castling, creating a dynamic pawn tension that invites further engagement. Relocating the knight to b6 skillfully avoids the bishop's gaze on g2 and prepares to contest the d4 square, subtly shifting the battleground towards the center. Securing the king's safety is paramount. This castling maneuver tucks it away behind a pawn shield, initiating the endgame phase of development and allowing the rooks to connect, potentially eyeing open files later. Developing the bishop to the king's Indian-style square prepares for castling and unblocks the queen, a sensible piece of coordination. Securing the queenside pawn structure, a3 aims to prevent black's b5 ideas and solidify white's central influence, creating a firm foundation for future piece development and potential kingside advances while subtly preparing to challenge black's queenside expansion. Securing the monarch, a vital defensive maneuver, now brings the king to safety behind a pawn shield, preparing for potential pawn storms and freeing the rook for active play. Initiating a queenside expansion, white boldly stakes a claim on the queenside territory, preparing to potentially dislodge black's knight and gain space. Developing the bishop to this square initiates a beautiful piece of quiet coordination, aiming to solidify the central pawn chain and prepare for potential advances on the queen side. This repositioning also seeks to contest the open c-file, a vital artery for future operations. Anchoring the rook on the b-file aims to solidify control over this open file, potentially preparing a future advance with b5 to expand on the queen side and restrict black's pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing for potential pawn breaks, this move defensively shuns any immediate pawn advances on the king side, instead focusing on reinforcing the e5 pawn and restricting white's queenside expansion by creating a more robust pawn chain. Gaining crucial space on the queen side, the pawn now challenges the knight and prepares to push further, potentially opening lines or restricting black's development. Unleashing a knight towards the king's flank, 11. d4 boldly probes white's slightly exposed queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially exploit any weaknesses that may arise from the advanced b-pawn. A vital preparatory maneuver, this thrust secures the d4 knight's precarious outpost, clearing the path for a potential d2-d4 pawn push that aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and open lines for white's bishops. Exchanging the knight on f3 strategically simplifies black's position, but at the cost of white's bishop pair and a slightly less cramped central pawn structure. This decision hinges on whether black can effectively utilize the open lines and better pawn structure that will emerge, or if white's initiative and control of the center will prove more decisive. The move also aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses later on. Reclaiming the center and enhancing piece activity, the bishop now stands poised to influence the queenside and potentially prepare for an advance on the queenside flank. The queen embarks on an ambitious diagonal venture, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create queenside pressure, while the knight on d4 is still somewhat precariously placed. White immediately challenges the center, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for his bishops. This bold pawn thrust injects dynamism into what was becoming a rather static position, forcing black to make decisions about how to manage the newly created tension. The knight on b6 is now a potential target, and black's central control is under direct scrutiny. The rook now occupies the d-file, a crucial pathway opened by white's pawn push, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially launch counterplay. Refocusing the rook to the central files, preparing for potential kingside advances or reinforcing the queenside pawn chain, this maneuver signifies white's intention to maintain piece activity and avoid passive defense, seeking to unbalance the position after black's solidifying setup. Unleashing the kingside pawn to create space and potential breakthroughs, black ignites a strategic duel on the center, daring white to react to this bold pawn thrust aimed at disrupting white's harmonious piece development. Pressing the queenside pawn advance, white immediately challenges the advanced knight and seeks to restrict black's pieces, while subtly preparing to open the file for the rook. Challenging the central pawn chain, this advance immediately complicates white's kingside structure and injects dynamism into the position, seeking to pry open lines for black's pieces. Bolstering the central pawn chain with this bishop repositioning aims to solidify white's pawn island on the queenside, while simultaneously preparing to bring the bishop back into the fray on a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside if black overcommits. Challenging the central pawn structure, black injects dynamic tension with c5, aiming to rip open the position and exploit the space created by white's earlier b-pawn advance. This move signals a bold intent to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and potentially untangle black's own somewhat cramped knights. It's a gamble that could lead to sharp tactical skirmishes, where precise calculation will be paramount for both sides. The knight on b6 now has a more active role, eyeing the c4 square and contributing to the central pressure. Unlocking the c-file now presents an immediate tactical dilemma for black, forcing a difficult decision about pawn structure and piece activity. Black's pawn recaptures, finally resolving the central tension and opening the b-file for potential counterplay, though the doubled c-pawns now present a structural weakness that white's bishop can potentially exploit on the long diagonal. Sharpening the attack along the queen's file, this maneuver aims to immediately challenge black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the vulnerable king. Black's pawn thrust cracks open the center, injecting dynamic tension and aiming to dismantle white's central pawn structure while challenging the bishop on g2. This pawn capture initiates a critical battle for central control and pawn structure integrity, potentially opening lines for your rook towards the d-file while forcing black to commit their own pawns. Reshaping the central landscape, black's queen reclaims lost territory, establishing a more robust pawn structure and aiming to untangle the pieces from the current congested state, while simultaneously challenging white's control over the vital c-file which just became open. Shifting the bishop to the edge of the board, white subtly reinforces the queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the slight overextension of black's pieces after the recent exchanges and prepare a potential advance with the pawn. Focusing the bishop towards the open central files, 21, bf6, demonstrates a proactive intention to engage the opposing pieces directly, potentially disrupting white's already slightly awkward pawn structure and seeking active counterplay rather than passively defending. Unlocking the c-file for an assault on black's central structure is the immediate objective, as the rook now gains unimpeded passage, preparing to double up and exert pressure. Seeking to untangle the cramped queenside and disrupt white's battery on the c-file, black repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to potentially pressure the bishop on b2 and create new avenues for counterplay. Repositioning the queen to the powerful b1 square shores up the d1 defense, prepares for a potential kingside pawn push, and offers flexibility for future queenside maneuvering, while simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable b7 pawn and potentially creating discovered attack opportunities down the c-file. Shifting the rook to the open file aims to activate this piece and create immediate pressure, forcing white to react and potentially address the exposed d4 pawn. Pushing the pawn here injects immediate dynamism into the position, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially liberate white's rooks. This aggressive flank play seeks to exploit the open files and create new avenues of attack, a calculated risk to break black's solid defense and create complications. The knight's jump to c4 injects significant dynamic tension, challenging the structural integrity of white's queenside pawn chain and forcing a decision on the vulnerable b5 square. Clearing the way for the rook's infiltration, this capture sacrifices the bishop, unlocking a dynamic central confrontation and forcing a reckoning with the pawn's structure's integrity. Black recaptures the pawn, introducing a fascinating tension as the rooks now eye the open files, potentially leading to a sharp battle for central control where piece activity becomes paramount. This redeployment of the rook to the open d-file aims to contest central influence and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece activity along this important corridor, while also offering a crucial defensive posture should black's queen or rook seek to infiltrate. Unleashing the rook from its cramped position, 26. RB8 aims to activate this major piece, preparing to contest the open b-file and potentially challenge white's pawn structure on the queen side. Asserting influence over the c-file, this maneuver aims to neutralize black's recently established battery and reassert central control, potentially setting up a future kingside attack by clearing lines for white's pieces. The offered queen exchange immediately simplifies the position, removing a key attacking piece for black, but also opening up the d-file for white's rook and potentially activating the bishop pair. Black seems to be anticipating a potential kingside attack from white and seeks to reduce white's attacking options, accepting a slight positional concession in exchange for material simplification. This could be a wise decision if black feels they can handle the ensuing rook and pawn endgame. Seizing the open b-file offers a dynamic territorial advantage, fundamentally altering the complexion of the board by opening up possibilities for an aggressive rook sortie and potentially isolating black's queenside. The board has simplified significantly, and this capture on the rook opens the door to a decisive material imbalance, as white now has a knight advantage after the exchange, preparing to consolidate and exploit the open c-file for their remaining rook. The rook now dominates the open central file, a potent presence that threatens to dismantle black's defensive structure by exploiting the c-file's potential. Trading that bishop for the rook opens up a clear path for your rook to dominate the now open central file. Reigniting the central battleground by redeploying the knight to d2 not only shores up the now isolated pawn on c5, but also strategically prepares to contest the crucial d-file, potentially forcing black's bishop from its active square on a1 and creating opportunities for white's rooks to coordinate more effectively along open or semi-open lines. Rethinking pawn structure is paramount, with the bishop now eyeing the weakened dark squares on the queen side. The rook slides to the 7th rank, a powerful assertion aiming to disrupt black's pawns and potentially infiltrate the queenside. This aggressive maneuver immediately challenges black's pawn structure and creates significant pressure, forcing a careful defensive response. The rook's relocation to the 2nd rank immediately forces a reevaluation of the material balance, now that the queens have been exchanged, and the bishop pair is no longer a factor for white. Black's intention seems to be reinforcing the pawn on b2 and preparing for potential pawn advances or piece activity along the 2nd rank, potentially targeting the g2 bishop or creating threats against the king if white is not careful. This creates an interesting dynamic where black's rook becomes a surprisingly active defender, simultaneously exerting pressure and creating counterattacking possibilities. Repositioning the knight to f1 opens avenues for potential pressure along the kingside, aiming to support a later kingside pawn push or redeploy the knight to more active squares. Probing for weaknesses, h5 attempts to create a pawn lever on the kingside, potentially initiating a dangerous advance or at least securing more territory for the king. A strategic repositioning to bolster the kingside pawn structure, aiming to prevent black's knight from finding a foothold on g4 and simultaneously preparing a potential advance of this pawn. Securing the king on the edge of the board with kh7 solidifies the monarch against any potential infiltrations along the 7th rank, subtly preparing for a long-term defense in this evolving endgame scenario. The king steps out from behind the pawn's shield, a calculated risk to activate its defensive and offensive potential in the dawning endgame. Unleashing the rook's power along the 2nd rank, this maneuver seeks to exploit the suddenly exposed white king and potentially create threats on the file, a direct challenge to white's current passivity. Seizing the open file, white aggressively snatches the pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pieces and create immediate threats, though this might leave the rook somewhat exposed on its new outpost. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal aims to disrupt white's potential rook infiltration along the 7th rank and simultaneously offers a better defensive structure for the pawn chain, potentially preparing for a counteroffensive once the material imbalance is addressed.